it's quite interesting that you can follow something called the typology of the hilt, so this area of the sword here. And with Saxon and Viking swords, this changes over a sort of the entire range of that time period, mainly in the shape of the pommel, so this part of the hilt, the top part. And it lands nicely in the middle of the 10th century as this kind of triangular pommel that you've got here. We've got one that's called a three-lobed pommel, so it's got a little blob on one side, a central piece, and then one on the left-hand side. But that sort of triangular shape, very, very typically Viking. Two-sided blade as well, so it's not got one edge on it, it's got two edges that you can use for cutting in two directions, and it's a one-handed sword, so when that had a grip on it, you would have used just one hand to hold it.
There is Viking writing upon it?
Yes, so this is one of the most fantastic things about this sword. Firstly, the preservation. When it was found, the remains of the scabbard were actually found lying above the sword. We were able to tell the makeup of the scabbard, so it's got wooden and leather and sort of fur, a combination holding it together. But as that degraded preferentially to the metal of the sword, it's actually meant that the blade has been preserved so well that not only can you see this strange writing on the blade, it's also preserved the black patina on the rest of the blade. That's not any type of corrosion on the original. It's actually an intentional sort of patina to make it look and shine black, which is quite rare for a sword. The writing itself is, yes, it's actually a name. So this is a name, Ulfbert. And Ulfbert swords are actually found throughout Europe. Now, the original theory for this is that Ulfbert is a blacksmith or a smith or a sword maker, and it would have been like a mark of sort of a brand almost. But the thing is that Ulfbert's very, very good at making these swords. They're all extremely high quality, they're beautifully made, and they're actually quite well preserved in the archaeological record. However, there are so many of them, and they stretch for about 250 years, which suggests that it wasn't just one man, it wasn't just Ulfbert who was making these. This brand lived on from his name, so he created these wonderful swords, and then in the years following his death, they carried on making them, they carried on with the same sort of prestige as well. Now ours is theoretically an Ulfbert. You can see on this replica that the letters have been painted on, and you can see that they've been painted on with little gaps in, and that's because although our preservation is good, we can't quite tell exactly what all of these letters are. It does follow the pattern for Ulfbert swords, and the letters are fairly in the right places. You also have these Greek crosses, so the square crosses within the name, which again is fairly typical of the ones that are found throughout Europe.
But you have reason to believe this is a fake.
I wouldn't say the word fake, because that implies that somebody today has come along and made a fake Viking sword, and we've got it in our collection, and we think it's Viking, but it's not. But I think this is more of a knockoff. So your cheap pair of branded sort of trainers, the ones that you might get from a market stall, for example. So something that looks like a real Ulfbert sword, but isn't quite. And this is because of another addition after the name. So again, this is very difficult to see on the replica, but through the use of X-rays, they've looked at the way that this blade was made, and in order to put the silver lettering in, you make an incision, you make a cut into the blade, so that it's filled into those spaces. So with an X-ray, you can see where the original letters would have been, even if you've ended up with a kind of smushed pattern at the end there. And these words are thought to make up the words me fecit or me fecit, which means made me. So the implication is Ulfbert made me. Now, after what I've said previously, that makes sense. I've said Ulfbert's a blacksmith, he's making these swords, and it's his product. So, of course, that makes sense. However, out of all of the Ulfbert swords that have been found and recognised, none of them say me fecit. Absolutely none of them that have been found so far. However, there are other types of swords, also made by other blacksmiths. There's a rival company around about the same point in time called Ingelry swords. And again, it says the word Ingelry down the blade. And there's a few of those that after that word say me fecit. But none of the Ulfbert ones do. Now, the reason I think that this is a bit of a knockoff is because not only is Ulfbert written slightly differently to the other examples, we've also got one that says me fecit. So maybe somebody's got a bit confused somewhere along the line. They've seen an Ingelry somewhere, they've seen an Ulfbert somewhere, and they've kind of smushed the two ideas together. And the other reason I think this is because the other British swords are all a little bit odd. They're all sort of spelt wrong, the examples of these Ulfbert ones, or there's something just a bit off about them. The other part is the pattern on the back. Ulfbert swords all have these lines and kind of diamond-shaped patterns on the reverse side. And in Gelri tend to have a different sort of pattern, and this is usually fairly sort of standard on an Ulfbert sword. But again, the British ones, there's always something a little bit funky going on, something a little bit strange. So there's a theory that we actually have these being produced in Britain in this kind of style that originally is coming from sort of Frankish areas. So rather than Scandinavia, more from the Rhine. Now, ours, however, because they're either spelt wrong or a little bit strange, are more possibly being made in Britain. Sadly, we can't exactly prove it, but it's a really interesting thing that hopefully with sort of future discoveries of more of these swords, which is happening every day, as more and more museums look at the swords they have in their collections with more modern techniques, using X-ray on blades that have never been X-rayed before, more and more of these swords are becoming recognised. So who knows, maybe in the future we'll find another one like ours, and maybe it's not a knockoff.
Regardless of whether or not it is a knockoff, it's still a valuable object and would have belonged to someone of high rank?
Absolutely. Regardless of it being a slightly wonky Ulfbert, the way that the blade is made is actually rather beautiful. When I was talking about the black patina earlier, that is not easy or cheap to do. And altogether, swords like this are absolutely weapons of status. In the sort of Viking and Saxon period, not everybody would have used a sword in battle. It's usually your most sort of wealthy of warriors. You'll have things like spears and axes being used on the battlefield by people of a slightly lower class. Also with this sword in particular, we have evidence that the hilt would have been wrapped in silver thread or silver wire as well. So there's that extra addition of sort of expensive materials. Plus, like I said, that black patina and the writing on the blade. No matter what, coming up against a warrior on the battlefield who's waving a sword around with a silver-coloured hilt and a big black blade with writing on it, you'd be terrified. So real sort of wealth, status and power.
What's the current theory as to how it ended up where it did?
An interesting question. I personally wouldn't like to land in any particular court with this theory because there's just so many ways that things can end up in the archaeological record. The difficult thing about this is there's not a lot of information about where exactly the sword itself was found in terms of stratigraphy, because it was actually found after the excavations ended. So we just simply don't have that information. So trying to infer where it lies within the area it was deposited, very hard. But you're looking at the city walls, and we have evidence of medieval and Saxon life continuing in this area. We know that this was a time period riddled with warfare, and if somebody had a sword like this, perhaps they were involved in a skirmish. There are some theories that this was possible. Maybe it was dumped after a battle, but also one of my longest lasting theories for pretty much any kind of exciting, expensive, or rather stylish object that's been sort of dumped somewhere a bit suspicious, like the edge of the city walls, is how do we know that this wasn't just stolen or taken from somebody and it's been dumped somewhere to come and pick up later, or someone's sort of getting rid of the evidence maybe? Pure speculation. I get very excited about these things. We probably will never know, but it's nice to theorise, isn't it?
You're a right little Miss Marple, you are. I take it this is a period when the Saxons and the Vikings were fighting over the territory?
Well, the thing is, it's a very difficult period to pin down in terms of that. You have eventually a division between land, very roughly between the north and the south, with the Vikings sort of settling up in Jorvik, and the south being sort of brought together under Alfred the Great. But this is a very kind of tricky situation where it's a nice idea to say that yes, peace was formed and they sort of lived in harmony. This is not the case. People always fight over land. It's just interesting to think why somebody with such a beautiful sword was fighting or using it or holding it near the walls of Bath.